It's New Year's Eve, December 31, 1986, around 3:30 in the afternoon. Picture a casino floor, slot machines chiming, cigarette smoke hanging low, the murmur of voices, clinking glasses. Then, without warning, the lights go dim. Heat hits your face and black smoke pours into the room. People scream. Some rush a set of doors that won't open. Others smash through glass and jump. Helicopters appear overhead. In less than an hour, nearly 100 people will be dead. This is the Dupont Plaza Hotel in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I'm Elena Martinez, and this is Still Unanswered. We're going to spend the next hour tracing how a place meant for celebration became one of the deadliest hotel fires in U.S. territory, and asking who exactly was responsible. It's a heavy story, and there are many pieces: labor strife, management decisions, engineering failures, and a criminal act that turned deadly. Joining me is Dr. Robert Hale, a fire protection engineer who studied the Dupont Plaza investigation and its long shadow on codes and practice. Robert, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Elena. It's good to be here. This event is one of those grim case studies that keeps fire protection professionals awake at night. There's a lot to unpack: technical, legal, and human.
Robert, before we dive into the fire's mechanics, help our listeners picture the island and the property. Puerto Rico in the mid-1980s, the economy, tourism, and why a hotel like Dupont Plaza mattered.
Sure. In the 1980s, Puerto Rico relied heavily on tourism, especially districts like Condado, where Dupont Plaza stood. Hotels and casinos were economic symbols: jobs, tax revenue, the whole winter getaway industry for U.S. tourists. At the same time, there were sharp labor tensions. Service workers, maintenance staff, casino employees, many unionized, were fighting low wages and job instability. So you had this collision: economic hope on one side and intense labor conflict on the other.
Right, and the Dupont Plaza was, historically, not a new property. It opened in 1963 as the Puerto Rico Sheraton and was later rebranded as the Dupont Plaza Hotel and Casino around 1980. By 1986, it was an aging 17-story tower with about 423 guest rooms, plus a 2-story casino and ballrooms. Those physical details matter a lot when we talk about fire behavior. Can you explain why?
Absolutely. The building was typical of mid-century construction: reinforced concrete, vertical shafts, multiple circulation paths. But critical details stood out. There was no automatic sprinkler system across most of the property. Fire alarm and detection systems were inadequate or not functioning in large areas. And egress paths, stairways, and emergency exits were not always accessible or properly configured. Those design and maintenance gaps multiply risk. If a fire starts in a high fuel load area near public spaces, ballrooms, casinos, the lack of sprinklers and reliable alarms can let a fire move from a small ignition to a flashover very quickly.
It's chilling to hear those pieces laid out. A quick note for listeners: a 1985 local inspection had already flagged multiple safety deficiencies at Dupont Plaza, including malfunctioning equipment and a lack of evacuation plans. The property's sprinkler system, what little there was not automated, unlike in approximately 95% of U.S. hotels by that time. Okay, so we have a tense labor climate and known safety problems. Let's talk about the labor dispute itself. Robert, summarize Local 901 and what was at stake.
Local 901 of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters represented about 250 of the hotel's roughly 450 employees, so roughly half the workforce. Negotiations began in October 1986. The union claimed management planned to fire about 60 union employees and replace them with non-union workers. For staff, that wasn't just about wages. It was a threat to livelihoods and community stability. By late December, tensions had escalated. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, this was a powder keg.
And in the days before the fire, there were several smaller, suspicious blazes: a linen closet, a pile of cardboard boxes, a roll of carpeting. Staff and vendors were talking. People were warning tourists to stay away. Even Governor Rafael Hernandez Colón later said information was circulating that something was going to happen. It's a nervous context. Robert, do you think the earlier fires and the rumor mill changed how people behaved that day?
They absolutely changed the context. When people have heard repeated warnings, small fires, threats, there's a heightened sense of threat and distrust. Yet the organizational response, management, regulators, didn't dramatically alter occupancy or increase protective measures. That dissonance is important. The risk landscape was clearly elevated, but the controls were not tightened correspondingly.
So let's move to the afternoon of December 31. At about 3 p.m., there was a union meeting in the ballroom where roughly 125 members voted to strike at midnight. The hotel was nearly full. Estimates put 900 to 1,000 guests on the property. And later that afternoon, 3 workers, members of the union, set a fire. Robert, tell us who these men were and what investigators found about their intent.
The 3 convicted were Hector Escudero Aponte, a 35-year-old maintenance worker, Armando Jimenez Rivera, 29, a bartender's assistant, and Jose Francisco Rivera Lopez, 40, a bartender. They pleaded guilty in federal court. Officially, their stated intent, according to investigators and the guilty pleas, was to set small fires to scare tourists and pressure management, not to cause mass casualties. They used chafing dish fuel, the kind of sterno cans common in food service, to ignite stored furniture in a ballroom storage room.
But, of course, the result was not a small scare. Around 3:30 p.m., the chafing fuel was lit under stacks of newly purchased, unboxed furniture, dressers, mattresses, sofa beds, all in cartons. That's an extreme fire load in a confined space. Robert, walk us through what happens when a fire like that gets established.
When you have a high fire load, lots of combustible material packed together, heat release rates can climb extremely fast. The room can reach flashover, a nearly simultaneous ignition of all exposed combustible surfaces when temperatures soar. In Dupont Plaza, the fuel, room geometry, and openings to adjacent spaces created conditions for rapid heat and smoke production. Once flashover occurs in a compartment, the fire can project superheated gases and flame outward, seeking paths of least resistance: stairwells, open staircases, ceiling devices, vertical shafts. That's exactly what happened. Superheated gases surged up a grand staircase and into the lobby, and smoke was pulled into the casino's smoke eater devices intended for cigarette smoke.
Listeners, that detail about the smoke eaters is important and chilling. Devices meant to clear cigarette smoke ended up drawing fire and smoke into the casino. The result was a rapid and deadly spread. Now, the casino itself was a nightmare of blocked egress. Robert, describe the situation on the casino floor and why so many people couldn't escape.
The casino was packed. About 150 guests or more were inside when the smoke and flames arrived. Critically, some emergency exit doors had been locked earlier to reduce theft. The primary remaining exit doors opened inward. Outward opening egress doors are a basic safety requirement because inward opening doors become impossible to open when a crowd presses against them. That created fatal bottlenecks. Some people were crushed, others were overcome by heat and smoke. Elevators were another hazard. Some people used them and were taken into the fire zone. Several victims were found in elevators that opened directly where the fire was active.
The images that came out of that day, people jumping through glass, helicopters on the rooftop, the casino full of smoke, were broadcast live on mainland U.S. television. But numbers matter here. Sources vary a bit, but investigators typically cite 96 to 98 deaths, with 97 often used as the figure. Of those, 84 were found in the casino, 5 in the lobby, 3 in an elevator, and the rest in other locations. About 140 people were injured, burns, smoke inhalation, broken bones from jumps. One of the victims was Secret Service agent Manuel de Jesus Marrero Otero, who was there on an investigation. Robert, how did emergency response play out that afternoon?
The first alarm reached the Puerto Rico Firefighters Corps around 3:40 p.m. The response included roughly 13 or 14 fire trucks, over 100 firefighters, and around 35 ambulances. Firefighters battled the main body of the fire for about 3 hours before it came under control, though heavy smoke persisted into the night. Rooftop rescues became improvised and crucial. Civilian helicopters, police, the National Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, and Navy helicopters from Roosevelt Roads participated in lifting victims off the roof to nearby landing zones. Those rooftop scenes, people huddled in smoke, helicopters overhead, are iconic and traumatic.
I want to pause here and let that sink in. We often talk about numbers and codes, but there were real people, families, vacations, someone celebrating the new year. Survivors described opening their doors to black, rolling smoke, having seconds to decide whether to run, hide, or go to the roof. Casino patrons spoke about lights going out, heat, and toxic smoke dropping fast, people pounding on locked doors. Some smashed plate glass and jumped to a pool deck below. Robert, given the speed of the fire and these human behaviors, what could have made the difference?
Multiple things. Functioning. Building-wide automatic sprinklers would likely have slowed or suppressed the early fire growth. Reliable detection and alarm systems would have given occupants earlier warning. Unobstructed and properly configured egress doors, outward opening exits, and maintained escape routes would have allowed safer evacuation. Staff training and clear evacuation plans also matter a lot. When multiple layers fail at once, sprinklers, alarms, unlocked exits, emergency lighting, the margin between a survivable event and a catastrophic one disappeared.
It's a cascade effect. One failure compounds another. After the initial rescue and firefighting, investigators looked into origin and cause. The ATF's National Response Team led the origin and cause work, with NIST, the U.S. Fire Administration, and NFPA experts helping. They concluded the ignition was in the ballroom storage area and was consistent with a liquid fuel ignition source, chafing fuel. The 3 men we mentioned pleaded guilty in federal court in April 1987, but the legal story doesn't stop there.
Right. Beyond the criminal prosecutions, there were massive civil suits. Over 2,300 plaintiffs and more than 250 separate lawsuits were eventually consolidated. Defendants included hotel owners, operators, design professionals, security contractors, and furniture manufacturers, because the storage and characteristics of that furniture contributed to the fire load. Total payouts and settlements exceeded $210 million. That's one of the largest fire-related settlements at the time.
and OSHA found 25 safety violations, including locked exits, missing evacuation doors, and non-functional detection systems. The courts and settlements, in effect, recognized widespread negligence, even as the 3 arsonists were held criminally responsible. Robert, does the presence of criminal intent absolve management or regulators of responsibility, or is it more complicated?
It's more complicated. Criminal intent by the arsonists is undeniable. But when a criminal act intersects with pre-existing negligence, the resulting tragedy is rarely reducible to a single cause. Management's decisions, locking exits, storing flammable furniture near public spaces, operating without adequate sprinklers or alarms, created vulnerability. Regulators had inspected and found deficiencies as early as June 1985, yet corrective actions were not sufficient to prevent disaster. In legal terms, proximate cause can be shared. In moral terms, too, responsibility is often distributed.
Yeah. That tension between individual criminal acts and systemic failures is one of the reasons we titled this series Still Unanswered. We can identify the arsonists, we can count settlement dollars, but other questions linger. Did union leadership know more than they disclosed? Did management downplay risks for economic reasons? Were inspectors hamstrung? Robert, what did the sentencing look like?
On June 22, 1987, the federal sentences were handed down. Hector Escudero Aponte received concurrent 99-year terms, including for the first-degree murder of Agent Marrero Otero. Jose Francisco Rivera Lopez was sentenced to 99 years in federal prison. Armando Jimenez Rivera received 75 years. At the Commonwealth level, Jimenez Rivera and Rivera Lopez pleaded guilty to reduced second-degree murder counts and received 96 life sentences, more symbolic given the concurrent nature with federal time. Over the decades, there have been parole hearings and media interviews that reignited debate about remorse and punishment.
Those are huge sentences, and they reflect the magnitude of the loss. But as you mentioned earlier, the civil system pointed to corporate and design failures. AIG, a principal underwriter, later acquired the property in 1989 and initiated a full renovation. In 1995, the hotel reopened as the San Juan Marriott Resort and Stellaris Casino. The site was rebuilt to modern standards with sprinklers and updated systems. Robert, what legislative or regulatory changes followed nationally?
Dupont Plaza, along with earlier disasters such as the MGM Grand Fire in 1980, helped catalyze federal action. The Hotel and Motel Fire Safety Act of 1990 required hotels that want to host federal government employees or government-funded events to have hardwired smoke detectors in every guest room and automatic sprinkler systems in buildings higher than 3 stories. It also created a national master list of compliant hotels. That law, plus industry pressure, led many hotels to accelerate retrofits, installation of sprinklers, better alarms, clearer evacuation plans. Over time, these changes reduced the incidence of multiple fatality hotel fires in the U.S.
So there was a policy response that likely saved lives in the long run. But policy doesn't bring back the dead, and it doesn't erase what survivors and families endured: PTSD, survivor's guilt, and lifelong trauma. Robert, in your work with NIST and fire science training, how is Dupont Plaza taught to new engineers?
The NIST engineering analysis of the early stages of fire development at Dupont Plaza is a staple in fire engineering education. It's used to illustrate how a high-compartment fire load leads to rapid heat release, how flashover occurs, and how smoke moves through openings and vertical shafts. The case also demonstrates the human factors, locked exits, inward opening doors, and the tragic consequences of design decisions that ignore egress. It's a sobering example. The physics are important, but so are the human and organizational choices.
There's also the question of memory. The hotel reopened, remodeled, and today exists as a luxury resort. Some survivors and relatives maintain online memorials. Public on-site memorialization appears limited. That contrast, pools and sunbathers where people once jumped through glass to escape, raises ethical questions. Robert, do you think commercial sites of major tragedies should carry more visible memorials?
I think there's no one answer. On the one hand, businesses reopen, economies recover, and communities need livelihoods. On the other, there's a moral obligation to remember and honor those who died. Practical memorials, plaques, dedicated spaces, annual remembrances can provide acknowledgement without preventing renewal. Ignoring the past creates distance and can make lessons fade. But decisions about memorialization are often local and political, and survivors' voices should be central in those choices.
That's fair. I want to take a moment here to read a few details listeners might find important. The official death toll, sources vary. 96 to 98 deaths are reported, with 97 often cited. About 140 injured. More than 2,300 plaintiffs filed lawsuits. Settlements and judgments exceeded $210 million. OSHA cited 25 safety violations. Those numbers are part of the public record. Robert, were there technical surprises investigators found during analysis?
A few technical points stood out. One, the way smoke eater devices, intended to remove light cigarette smoke, created airflow patterns that drew smoke and hot gases into occupied spaces. Two, elevators operating during the fire took passengers into danger, something we now manage much more strictly. Three, the storage of a high fuel load, new furniture in cartons, adjacent to a public assembly space was a critical mistake. The combination of those elements, with inadequate detection and no automatic suppression, led to rapid development and spread.
Scary combinations. I want to bring us back to the people who lit that fire. The three men said they intended a small scare. But setting fuel under boxed furniture isn't a small fire, at least not by engineering standards. Robert, can we talk about misconceptions? How do lay people misjudge fire risk compared to what we know scientifically?
Lay people often think of fire in linear, visible terms. A small flame that can be put out, a controllable smoke. But the physics are nonlinear. When you have a lot of combustible material in a confined space, rates of heat release can escalate exponentially. Smoke production increases toxicity and reduces visibility, and temperatures can reach flashover very quickly, sometimes in minutes. What might seem like a nuisance fire to someone who's never seen flashover can become an unsurvivable event in a short time.
So intent matters, but so does ignorance of fire dynamics. Robert, earlier you mentioned elevators. Investigators found victims in elevators that opened into the fire zone. How has egress practice changed since then?
Significantly. Modern codes require more rigorous controls. Automatic recall functions for elevators, better compartmentation around stairs and shafts, mandatory smoke detection tied into building systems, and stricter rules about inward versus outward door swings for egress paths. Hotels now more commonly have automatic sprinklers and hardwired detection in each guest room. Training and evacuation planning are also emphasized. Those changes reduce the chance a trapped person will step into a smoke-filled corridor or be taken by elevator into danger.
We've covered how the fire started, how it spread, and some of the legal and regulatory aftermath. But still unanswered is also about the questions that remain politically and morally. For instance, could the disaster have been prevented if warnings, those earlier small fires, and the rumor that something would happen had been escalated differently? Or were there systemic pressures, economic, political, that kept dramatic action from being taken? Robert?
Those are hard questions. From a safety management perspective, when you have repeated small fires and credible threats, elevated inspections, temporary occupancy reductions, and stronger security or mediation efforts are reasonable steps. Why those didn't happen is a mix of factors. Perhaps economic pressure to maintain full occupancy on the last day of the year, perhaps institutional inertia, perhaps local political dynamics. The record shows inspections had found deficiencies, but enforcement didn't prevent the tragedy. So there was a failure to close the loop between identified hazard and corrective action.
And then there's the union factor. Official investigations didn't prove that the union, as an institution, ordered the fire. The three actors were rank-and-file members. The union denied institutional involvement and even offered a reward for information. But in public memory, the event sometimes gets simplified to a union arson. That simplification can feed anti-union narratives. Robert, how should we understand the interplay between labor disputes and catastrophic outcomes like this?
Context is crucial. Labor disputes are sometimes associated with extreme actions by a few individuals, but it's rarely accurate to paint entire movements or unions with that brush. In this case, the individual's decisions were criminal and tragic. However, the broader story includes management decisions that heightened vulnerability and political environments that may have limited intervention. Understanding causation requires analyzing both the criminal acts and the systemic conditions that allowed the consequences to be so severe.
I want to pause with a very brief human aside. One of the victims was Secret Service agent Manuel de Jesus Marrero Otero, 49, who was in the hotel on a counterfeit investigation assignment. That detail pressed a federal charge of first-degree murder in Escudero Aponte's federal sentencing. It's a reminder that victims came from many walks of life: hotel staff, tourists, people doing their jobs. Robert, over 3 decades later, how should we keep the lessons of Dupont Plaza alive without using it purely as a cautionary tale divorced from the people involved?
We keep lessons alive by embedding them in practice codes, inspections, training, and by centering the voices of survivors and families in remembrance. Memorials and education can help maintain the human story behind the technical lessons. When we reduce a disaster to a checklist, we risk losing the human cost. Conversely, when we only tell the human story without the technical learning, the same mistakes can repeat. Both dimensions are needed.
I agree. Before we move to close, let's go through a few of the still unanswered questions I want listeners to consider. Number 1. Why did authorities and management not take stronger preventative measures when there were prior fires and explicit warnings? Number 2, to what extent should management and regulators bear moral and legal responsibility compared to the 3 individuals who set the fire? Number 3, how should the site be memorialized, if at all? And number 4, are there places today, hotels, high-occupancy buildings, where the combination of labor conflict, economic pressure, and lax enforcement could create another Dupont Plaza? Robert, pick one of those and reflect.
I'll pick the second. Apportioning responsibility. Legally, the criminal acts were punished. Civil suits and regulatory findings assigned liability and financial consequences to owners and operators. Ethically, I think responsibility is shared. The arsonists initiated the tragedy, but the conditions that amplified its deadliness, locked exits, absent sprinklers, ignored inspections, were choices made by organizations and regulators. The best way forward is accountability across the board. Criminal justice for the perpetrators, civil and regulatory consequences for negligent parties, and systemic reforms to prevent recurrence.
I'll pick the second. Apportioning responsibility. Legally, the criminal acts were punished. Civil suits and regulatory findings assigned liability and financial consequences to owners and operators. Ethically, I think responsibility is shared. The arsonists initiated the tragedy, but the conditions that amplified its deadliness, locked exits, absent sprinklers, ignored inspections, were choices made by organizations and regulators. The best way forward is accountability across the board, criminal justice for the perpetrators, civil and regulatory consequences for negligent parties, and systemic reforms to prevent recurrence.
Wait.
Sorry, I'm getting used to playing devil's advocate and hosting at once. Robert, one final technical question. You mentioned flashover a few times. For listeners who haven't heard that term, give a quick, plain language explanation.
Sure. Flashover is when a room becomes so hot that all exposed combustible surfaces ignite almost at once. It's like the point of no return in a compartment fire. Temperatures and smoke level rise rapidly, visibility drops, and conditions become unsurvivable very quickly. It's what witnesses often describe as an explosion, sudden, catastrophic expansion of fire energy. That's why early detection and suppression are so important, to prevent a compartment from reaching flashover.
Thanks. We've talked about the past, the investigation, and the reforms. Let's end with the present and the question of memory. The Dupont Plaza was renovated and reopened as the San Juan Marriott Resort and Stellaris Casino in 1995 after a $130 million renovation announced by AIG in 1992. That means tourists currently occupy a space that was, decades ago, a scene of mass tragedy. How do we balance commercial rebirth with remembrance? Robert.
Circling back to what I said earlier, honor the dead, but enable communities to sustain themselves. Practical memorialization options, plaques, remembrance programs, engagement with survivors groups can be integrated into a site's operations. Also, making safety visible, information about the hotel's safety systems, training, and history of improvements can be a way to acknowledge the past while showing commitment to the future. The key is centering the voices of those most affected in the decision.
Elena. Okay, Robert, we're looping on names here. Thank you for walking through this with me. Before we go, I want to read a short list of the primary sources for listeners who want to learn more. The NIST Dupont Plaza Overview and the NIST Engineering Analysis of the Early Stages of Fire Development, the Wikipedia Summary on the Dupont Plaza Hotel Arson, the Dupont Plaza Informational Site, NFPA summaries, UPI and Washington Post coverage from the time. Those contain the core timelines, numbers, and technical analysis we discussed.
And for listeners interested in the technical work, the NIST documents are particularly useful. They go into the fire dynamics and the modeling of early-stage development. They're sobering but instructive.
As we wrap, I want to leave listeners with one final reflection. Tragedies like Dupont Plaza are rarely the product of a single decision. They are produced at the intersection of human choices, criminal or otherwise, organizational priorities, and technical vulnerabilities. Justice can punish, settlements can compensate, codes can change. But preventing the next Dupont Plaza requires ongoing vigilance, inspectors who enforce, managers who prioritize safety over profit, workers whose grievances are addressed before desperation becomes violence, and an industry that remembers the human cost behind its standards. Robert, any last words?
Just this. The technical fixes make a difference, but culture matters too. Encourage reporting of hazards, act decisively on credible threats, and build systems that don't rely on luck. That's how we keep people safe.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you to our listeners for spending this hour with us. If you want to dive deeper, check the episode notes for links to the NIST reports, media coverage, and survivor resources. We'll be back next week with another episode of Still Unanswered. I'm Elena Martinez. Take care and be safe.